are new, my name is Sharon, and I am one of the pastors here at Bright City. And this morning we are finishing off our 4-week study of the spiritual discipline of solitude. And if you have been with us, you know that the way that we have defined this spiritual discipline has been not as disconnecting from community, but truly connecting with God. And so that's what we've been looking at the last several weeks. We are landing on that connecting with God piece. But 2 weeks ago, Ike looked at how solitude helps us to create this space to encounter ourselves, to examine our interior worlds. Last week, we looked at how solitude helps us to create space to encounter our enemy. And then we are finishing by looking at how solitude creates space to encounter God. And so this morning, as we land on that most important topic of all, I wanted to begin this discussion by talking about something that you would expect me to cover in a series on solitude, which is The Bachelor. So most of you don't need me to summarize what this reality TV show is about, but if you are one of the blessed remnant who has somehow managed not to have seen this show, The Bachelor is a reality show about a man who is looking for a wife, and in order to find his wife, he dates 25 women simultaneously. So what could possibly go wrong? But episode after episode, he takes these women on these romantic, grand dates, just really extravagant, and just woos them in all these spectacular ways. And then by the end of it, he proposes to one of these women. Now, not surprisingly, almost none of these relationships last. And there are many, many, many reasons why that is the case. But one of those reasons is that this show is predicated on this false premise that you can build a relationship, that you can sustain a relationship on these grand gestures, on these public displays of romance. And anyone who has been married for any amount of time at all knows that this is simply not true. One thing that a lot of you may not know about my husband, Ike, is he is an incredible romantic. Early in our marriage, I thought I was just really inspiring, like I was his muse. But what I realized over time is it really had very little to do with me personally and more to do with him. He's just a romantic at heart. And so this is an aspect of our marriage that I have loved. I have a lot of memories of him doing these romantic gestures, these public displays of romance that I treasure and are very special to me. But at the same time, those grand gestures are not what sustained our marriage. When I look back on some of the hardest seasons of our marriage, when we planted Bright City, we had 2 preschoolers and an infant. When we were leading our church through the pandemic, these were incredibly taxing on our relationship personally. But what sustained us during that time was not Ike taking me on these really romantic dinners or getting me flowers or these grand public gestures, although he did do those things. But what sustained us was largely unseen to the world around us. It was this quiet, sort of invisible work that was just between him and me, where we are coming toward one another and we're pursuing one another and we are prioritizing one another and leaning in when our circumstances were trying to pull us apart. That, not like hot air balloons over the Rockies, are what sustained our marriage. Now, this distinction between grand gestures and the real substance of a relationship is a helpful one in thinking about our relationship with God. especially as we close out our study of solitude, because so often we think it would be so much easier. Faith would be so much easier if God spoke to us in clear and dramatic ways, grand gestures, miracles. It would be so much easier to trust God and to follow him if God worked like that. And this is a conversation I actually have with my kids a lot. They're often asking me, why can't we see Jesus? It would be so much easier if we could see God. And so I think a lot of us wrestle with that tension that God's making it unnecessarily hard on himself. If you just did more miracles, more people would believe. But grand gestures are not the substance of our relationship with God any more than they are the substance of a marriage. And this contrast is nowhere more apparent than in the story we are going to be looking at this morning. Up until now in the series on solitude, we have exclusively focused on Jesus and how Jesus practiced this spiritual discipline and what this means for our lives. But one of the most famous stories of solitude, and particularly how solitude creates this space for this encounter with God, actually comes to us from the Old Testament in the life of the prophet Elijah. And so we're going to look at this story, and it's going to help us to understand why solitude is such an essential part of our relationship with God. And so we're going to be in 1 Kings 19 this morning. This is actually one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. And in just a moment, I'm going to read to you a longer portion of that chapter than Emily read. But before we get into it, I want to orient you to Elijah, because we have not studied Elijah here at Bright City in quite some time. And so I know not all of you are familiar with this Old Testament prophet. But first, I'm going to put a timeline up on the screen just to orient you to where he is in the Old Testament. So Elijah lived about 900 years before the birth of Jesus. And he comes on the scene. What is significant about Elijah's work as a prophet is he comes on the scene after the kingdom of Israel has divided in two. A lot of you will know that King David reigned over the kingdom of Israel, but after his reign, the kingdom split into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And so Elijah inhabits that northern kingdom. And the work that God has called him to is to rebuke the king of Israel. Because that king, his name is Ahab, and he was a wicked king. He married a woman named Jezebel who worshiped a foreign god named Baal. And so she influenced Ahab, and then Ahab influenced the nation of Israel to basically practice idolatry under his influence. And even worse than that is they started to persecute the prophets of God. They were trying to eradicate them entirely. And so that is the backdrop of Elijah as a prophet of God in Israel. He is vocally opposing Ahab and Jezebel. And because of this, they want him dead. And so that is where we are going to pick up in 1 Kings chapter 19. Starting with verse 1. It says, Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets of Baal with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, may the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba that belonged to Judah, he left his servant there, but he went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, I have had enough. Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. Suddenly, an angel touched him. The angel told him, get up and eat. Then he looked, and there at his head was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones and a jug of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord returned for a second time and touched him. He said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." So he got up, ate, and drank. Then, on the strength from that food, he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave there and spent the night. Suddenly, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of armies, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life." So he's basically answering this question of what are you doing here by saying, well, clearly you have rescued me. You have delivered me from this peril. Then God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." At that moment, the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. So as I mentioned, this is a very well-known story of one of God's prophets encountering him in solitude. But I recognize that for a lot of you, this is the first time you have ever heard this story. And so I want to briefly recap what it is that we just read. As I mentioned, Elijah hears about the threat on his life, and his response is to immediately fall apart. He throws a pity party. He wants to quit. And I'll tell you, this response has always fascinated me. Because up until this moment, and we didn't really get into all of this, but up until this moment, Elijah has been kind of a baller prophet. Like everything he touched succeeded. He publicly humiliates the prophets of Baal and then ultimately oversees their execution. He raises a person from the dead. And so up until now, everything has been up and to the right for Elijah. And yet, at the first real sign of opposition, he despairs. He wants to give up. He even wants to die. And so just immediately, he's in this very, very dark place. And one of the reasons we can tell he is in this dark place is that he is giving this exaggerated version of events. He's not seeing clearly. He says to God, "I am the only one left," when we know that that is not true. He's not the only faithful one left. He's not the only prophet left. Just a chapter prior, we learned that there are literally hundreds of other faithful prophets still in Israel. And so this is an emotional truth, not a factual one. Now, God does not argue with Elijah in this moment. Instead, he lets him simply take a nap, and then he feeds him, which I always have to laugh and feel convicted at the same time by this aspect of the story, because sometimes when we are discouraged, it is not the devil. We are just hangry. Sometimes we just need a snack. And so that's exactly what happens is he takes a nap, he has a snack, and then afterwards, God draws Elijah into the wilderness, into this 40-day journey of fasting as he travels to Mount Horeb. And this should really sound similar to us because last week we talked about God calling Jesus into the wilderness to fast for 40 days. And so there are a lot of parallels here. But once Elijah arrives at this mountain, he goes into a cave, and God invites Elijah to come out of the cave into his presence. However, right after this, we have this interesting series of events that transpire. So Elijah's in this cave and he hears this wind blowing outside, but we are told that the Lord is not in that wind. Then the mountain shakes, and yet we are told that the Lord is not in that earthquake. And then finally there is fire, but we are told that the Lord is not in that fire either. And more importantly, Elijah himself is moved by none of these things. He stays put until he hears this still small voice, as soft as a whisper. And this is what Elijah recognizes as the presence of God. This is what ultimately draws him out of the cave. And if we were to continue reading this story, this is what ultimately pivots him back into his calling. Now, as we close out this study of solitude, and specifically this morning, are thinking about solitude as this space that is primarily about encountering God. 3 truths emerge from this story of Elijah's encounter with God that are going to shape how we practice solitude going forward. Because after this series ends, our hope for you is that this is something you will continue to incorporate into your day-to-day. So the first takeaway that we can draw from this story that should inform our own practice of solitude, how we think about solitude, what it is when we are practicing solitude. Number 1 is that it is more important to hear from God than to hear from ourselves. And the reason why it's important for me to make this explicit is that this is not how the majority of us connect with God. This is not how the majority of us pray. For the majority of us, prayer, solitude, connecting with God looks like talking to God, not listening to God. And because that is what defines the majority of our prayer lives, that's why listening prayer is something that we as a church are very intentional about. If you ever come to our monthly prayer gathering, we always take time for listening prayer, where we simply sit and listen for the voice of God. This is something that we as a staff practice every single Tuesday morning when we pray over the different prayer requests in our churches. We begin by listening from God, because it is more important that we hear from God than we hear our own selves talking to God. Now, that's not to say that it is not important that we talk to God. That's not to say that it is not important that we examine ourselves. 2 weeks ago, Ike gave an entire sermon on the importance of examining yourself and inviting the Holy Spirit to search your interior world. It is important that we make our requests known to God. And yet, Elijah did that. Elijah brought his despair to God. He shared his feelings with God. And what we see here is that while his feelings are honest, they are not entirely truthful. As I already mentioned, mixed in with Elijah's feelings are distorted truths and really entire lies. And we can relate to this, right? When you get discouraged, how quickly do you start speaking in absolutes? You know, nobody cares about what I do. Like, how many moms? You know, nobody pays attention to everything I do around the house. My relationships always end badly. I'm the only one who is committed to this cause. This is what we see Elijah doing. I am the only one who is faithful left. And as I just mentioned, we know that this is not true, but more importantly than that, God could have easily looked at him and said, no, I am the only one faithful left. After all, Elijah, you just quit. So you quit, and then you come to me to tell me how faithful you are. Show of hands, who here has never quit? Who here has never given up on humanity? So there's a lot of audacity happening here in Elijah's heart. But thankfully, God does not respond that way because God is kind and he is patient and he is gracious. He doesn't say anything to him that he could have said, which is also a beautiful reminder to us that we can bring our unvarnished thoughts to God and we can vent to him. We can even be a little bit narcissistic, like he very much is right now, without fear of condemnation. And it is important that we do that, but it is even more important that we hear from God than we hear from ourselves, whether that looks like time in listening prayer or simply reading his word. And so that's our first takeaway from this story as we think about how we approach solitude in our lives, is that it is more important to hear from God than to hear from ourselves. That said, solitude is not about ultimately getting information from God. That is not the point. Which leads us to our second takeaway from this story, which is that intimacy. Intimacy is the point. This week, I wrestled with one aspect of this story that is a little bit mysterious. There's kind of a paradox in this story, which is that on the one hand, God makes this big effort to draw Elijah out of the noise of ministry, out of the noise of this persecution. I mean, it's like a 40-day margin of space that God is creating for Elijah in order to speak to Elijah. But I wonder if you notice, God was speaking to Elijah the entire time. And so at some point I thought, what does this mean? Like, why is God drawing Elijah into the wilderness so that he can encounter God when Elijah has been encountering him the entire time? And as I wrestled with this and processed what God was doing here, it dawned on me how often God does this. How God rarely speaks to his prophets in front of a crowd. When he has something to say to them, he actually draws them away and speaks to them in solitude. And so as I process what this means, what this pattern means, what I realize is that God doesn't simply want to talk to us. He wants to be with us. And I think that is important to remember as we close out our series on solitude, because we have over and over again, especially those of you in your small groups who've been watching these videos, there's been this emphasis on just the sheer practicality of this spiritual discipline because we live in such a noisy world. It is really important for us to reduce all of those inputs in order to hear from God. And that is all true. But I want to be really clear that it's not that God needs us to do that. It's not as if God cannot compete with the noise. You know, we are worshiping the God who literally spoke creation into existence. And so God's not sitting there thinking, how can I be louder than TikTok? And so this isn't purely practical. God could speak to us all day long if he so chose to do. But the fact of the matter is, God doesn't simply desire to communicate with us. This isn't just about getting a message to us. He wants to connect with us. And again, this is how marriage is a really helpful comparison, because it's not like Ike and I don't communicate when we're in front of our staff or when we're in front of our kids. We communicate all day long. But when we're in front of our staff, when we're in front of our kids, we're not really connecting. And it's definitely not intimate. We have to be alone for that. And it is the same with God. That is why he draws his prophets out into the wilderness. Not because that's the only place he can talk to them, but because he wants to be alone with them. That is why God speaks in a whisper, not to make his voice hard to hear, but so that you will draw closer to him, so you will lean in. Solitude is not a logistical necessity for a noisy world. Solitude is our response to God's desire for intimacy with us. That is our second takeaway. Getting to the third, as we talk about intimacy, I want to add that God desires intimacy not simply because he loves us, but because intimacy at the end of the day is also what sustains us. And this leads us to our third and final takeaway from this story, and our third and final takeaway as we embark on practicing solitude from here on out, which is that what sustains our faith is not grand gestures from God, but intimacy with God. And part of the reason that we draw this principle from this story is because of one other aspect of the story that I didn't mention. You see, by calling Elijah into the wilderness, by instructing him to fast for 40 days, by directing him to journey to Mount Horeb, and then raining down fire, wind, and earthquake, we are witnessing something that has happened before. What God is inviting Elijah to do here is actually to reenact scenes from the life of Moses. So much of this is stuff that we read about in Exodus when Moses receives the 10 Commandments. God calls him into the wilderness. He instructs him to fast for 40 days. He takes him up onto Mount Sinai, which incidentally is the same mountain as Mount Horeb. It just has a different name here. Takes him to the exact same mountain, and it's there on Mount Sinai that God comes to Moses in cloud and smoke and fire and earthquake. And it is through these signs and these wonders that Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And so this definitive word from God. And so it's not insignificant that God is now having Elijah reenact this entire thing, except with one key change, which is that God does not speak to Elijah through these miracles, through these grand gestures. Instead, he comes with a still small voice. Why the change? Well, I can tell you, first of all, what this does not mean, what this is not. This is not a rejection of God's previous ways of communicating. It's not a rejection of those grand gestures, of those signs and wonders. And part of the reason we know that is God will continue to perform miracles throughout history. He will continue to declare his glory and his character through these signs and wonders. And so it's not a rejection of those things. Instead, it is a reminder that grand gestures are not the only way, and more importantly, not the most powerful way that God speaks, which is a reminder that Elijah needed. Because Elijah, for the last several years, he'd had a front row seat to the miracles of God. And I actually suspect that is why he was so unmoved by the wind, by the earthquake, by the fire, is he'd already seen it. He'd already seen all of those things, and yet they did not protect him from disillusionment or despair. And so while we often think that faith would be easier if God would simply work through miracles, if we could just see God, if we could just see Jesus, if he would come through in a dramatic way, that would dispel all doubt. It would make it so much easier to trust him. When we look at the life of Elijah, we are reminded that miracles are not a cure-all. They do not make faith easier at all. What Elijah needed in this moment was not a grand gesture. What he needed in this moment was to truly connect with his God. So as we close out this study of solitude, I want to end this morning by addressing those of you who are in a season a lot like Elijah's. You are discouraged. You are on the brink of despair. The future is a question mark. You wonder where God is. Faith feels hard. It would be so much easier if God would just show up with one big sign. But if that is you, I want to say to you that what you need, what your soul needs, is not one big sign. What you need is time alone with the lover of your soul. You don't need the wind. You don't need the earthquake. You don't need the fire. You need the still, small voice of the creator of the universe, who is intimately present to your pain. And that is why we practice solitude. But as we close out this morning, I would be remiss if I did not also mention that God is not above a grand gesture. And we're about to remember the grandest of all when we take communion together. When we take communion together, we remember the good news of Jesus Christ, that God came to earth, that he lived and died to heal creation, to heal you. He would literally move heaven and earth out of love for you. And so this is not an either or. It's not about grand gestures or intimacy. It is both. God shouts his love to us, to you, in every single possible way. And so our invitation is simply to receive that love and to live out of it. My question for you this morning is, have you? Are you? Are you taking that time alone with God, that intimate time that your soul needs to sustain you? I'm going to go ahead and invite our prayer team forward. If you are in an Elijah season right now, we would be honored to pray over you, to pray with you and for you. Or you are welcome to sit in your seat, just remembering God's love, taking this time to connect with the lover of your soul. But if you are someone who has never known that love, maybe you have been a Christian your entire life, you were raised in the church, but this is the moment where it's finally starting to make sense, what it means to know Jesus, what is available to you in Jesus. But you've never said yes to that love. I'm going to invite you in the next few moments to say yes to Jesus today. Let's take some time to pray.